Welcome to our podcast in a new episode and a new season, the second half of the year 2023. We are at a very unusual place this time, unusual from the perspective of politics, but very fortunately it's a famous place and with a famous participant, Ferenc Krausz, the last Hungarian Nobel Prize laureate, the second in this year actually after Katalin Karikó. And this is I don't want to make a mistake, Center for Molecular Fingerprint, where he is leading a small group of very young people, as I've experienced entering the room and your offices, preparing and executing a new contribution to Hungarian, and as you previously formulated, universal science on an applied level. But we are going to come back to this. Really, it's our pleasure and joy to greet you in my podcast. And I believe this was a high season for you in terms of interviews, making it public actually what you're dealing with, and try to make people understand what exactly you are dealing with. Can you help us and the viewers, listeners of this podcast to understand what exactly you were awarded the Nobel Prize?
Thank you very much for this certainly exciting question. The main actors in the game, which we are pursuing now for quite a while, are electrons. They are tiny particles, subatomic particles, which are responsible for many important things that we may not be aware of, but we actually thank our existence and also basically the modern life to these particles. They are responsible for gluing atoms together to form molecules, which are known to be the basic functional building blocks of any living matter, living organism. And they are, of course, also responsible for all the processes that take place in chips, which are the kind of central elements of all our electronic gadgets. And basically switching on and off electric current is the basis for all the electronic equipments that we are using today. And we asked a question quite a while ago, not just we, but many other groups, whether we could somehow make the motion of these tiny, extremely swift particles accessible for human perception, for human observation. This was not possible in the last millennium. The fastest processes that could be followed with special techniques have been basically the breakage and the formation of chemical bonds, for which Ahmed Zuwail got the 1999 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. But the motion of electrons is by another factor of 100 to 1,000 faster than the motion of whole atoms in molecules. And that was the challenge. That was the challenge in the 90s. That's what attosecond physics is about. So quite a number of groups started working on that in the 90s. And we were lucky enough to be the first to be able to actually generate isolated pulses of attosecond light in the year of 2001. For the first time, and not just generate it, because that's not enough. We also needed to measure it, generate it and measured for the first time, isolated flashes of light that lasted shorter than a femtosecond, something like 650 attoseconds. And this is the time scale where we can freeze the motion of even electrons. Because what is the idea behind capturing fast motions? We know this from the macroscopic world. If we want to catch a Formula One car as it is crossing the finish line, what do we need? We need a very fast camera with a very short exposure time to make sure that we can produce a sequence of very short snapshots, right? The very fast exposure with a very fast exposure time. The exposure time has to be so short that the motion is frozen whilst the shutter of the camera is open. Otherwise the Formula One car would appear kind of in a smeared way on the picture. So very fast exposure, tuck, 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 a series of snapshots from which we can reconstruct the motion, and we can reconstruct at which instant actually the car really crossed the finish line. That's exactly the idea that we put into practice also in the capturing of electron motions. The only difference is that in that case we couldn't use millisecond exposure time cameras, but we needed an attosecond exposure time camera. And these are the attosecond pulses which we produced for the first time in 2001.
Very well. From your description, my perception is that this is exactly how your imagination back to your student years in Hungary, physics, has caught your attention, maybe your imagination. And it was a very nice description how we shall imagine actually the method for which you were awarded the prize. But how is it coming to application? How is it possible that a physicist's idea, a method, turns into science in another way? Because my understanding is that the applied end product of your research, method and research, comes not to the field of physics, but to the fields of medicine.
Well, this is one of the possible future applications. There are certainly quite a few applications in physics, chemistry, biology as well, but we have chosen actually an application in medicine. But before I come to answering that part of your question, let me just start with emphasizing that this research at the very beginning was a purely curiosity-driven basic scientific research. Of course, we scientists are always required to kind of envision some sort of possible future applications, which of course we necessarily have to do to convince funding agencies to provide funding for certain research. But to be quite honest, at a time when we started working towards attosecond pulse generation and capturing electronic motion, we were not really motivated by those possible future applications, but much more were driven by our curiosity. Why do I emphasize this? Because there is often a debate in society and politics. Well, should we fund basic science? Shouldn't we focus actually applied one, because that's what actually allows basically to improve people's life and improve basically economic powerfulness and things like that. But it's often overlooked that actually applied science, particularly completely new applications, build up on knowledge which always is generated by basic science in the first place. So we could impossibly foresee in the 90s that one day attosecond pulses, attosecond technology might open a new way for actually shaping the future of healthcare as a whole. And that's what the story of Center for Molecular Fingerprinting is about. This was just not possible for anyone to foresee, right? So if in Austria, in Germany, the science policy would have been such back in the 90s and afterwards that, wow, we don't see basically what this is good for, therefore we just don't fund this, then we would not be sitting here today. So this is, I think, really the main sort of lesson from the story before we actually come to the exciting applications.
Very well. In a recent interview, you have formulated this in a way that today healthcare is basically about unhealth, and that is illnesses, because by the time people get into healthcare institutions, they are already ill.
Precisely.
And one end outcome actually of your basic research and then the applied elements of it can become that you can prevent actually illnesses to develop, and early enough you can call attention of doctors, the patient itself, that he or she has to take care of something in his life. Is it the true direction actually of your?
Absolutely. This is at least the vision that drives us. This is what I like to call just cause. Of course, this is not the immediate goal, because the just cause, by definition, after Simon Sinek, is something that we probably are not able to achieve in our lifetime. Maybe generations are needed to achieve that. But the vision is indeed to transform healthcare as a whole from its current mostly reactive mode of operation to an entirely new mode of operation, to a proactive preventive mode of operation. What is currently the situation? I have concrete numbers from the United States. More than 95% of all the resources that are provided for healthcare are dealing with illnesses.
Already developed illnesses.
Less than 5% is spent for prevention. And most probably the numbers in other countries are not very different, if at all. Probably the preventive part is even smaller. That means that currently, indeed, the healthcare system is functioning such that it's a kind of innovating mode. Just wait until people develop symptoms which are kind of painful enough, which are kind of unpleasant enough to eventually go to a doctor. Unfortunately, most of us don't even go to a doctor when initial symptoms come, because okay, well, it's not so serious. Maybe in a few weeks I don't have this, and I don't have time for now with such a small thing running to a doctor, right? And although there are chronic diseases where even just the slightest symptom might already come too late, right? And if even don't go then, but wait, let's see. And then we go and see a doctor at last, because it doesn't cease, and it's still there after weeks and weeks and weeks. Then what happens is that we get a diagnosis which is truly shocking. And
it's probably too late, actually.
It's far too late. It's far too late. So in many cases, actually, in these three categories that I mentioned before, the basically cancer, cardiovascular disorders, metabolic disorders, if we go to a doctor, basically in all three cases, with symptoms that would really drive us to go to a doctor, that's in the overwhelming majority of cases is far too late. It's far too late. If we are lucky, then we still see a doctor that basically at least the progression of the disease can be kind of slowed down a bit. If we are not so lucky, then maybe even this is not possible anymore, right? This is the situation.
I wanted to come back some very fascinating, if you like, theoretical elements of what you were talking about. But before we do that, tell us something about the place we are, and that is the Center for Molecular Fingerprint, which is jointly funded by the Hungarian government and others. It's my understanding.
Purely by the Hungarian.
Purely Hungarian, that's right.
Purely Hungarian taxpayers' money. We should appreciate. So there is at the moment no funding from the European Union. This is particularly for those who might watch this contribution beyond the borders of Hungary.
Does it have anything to do with what you have already mentioned, actually, the applied version of what you were dealing with, or it's yet another approach?
This is exactly that, exactly. So basically, it was about 2015 when we started, when we actually basically arrived at a state when we thought, well, we have now demonstrated that this new technology is really useful in physics, in chemistry. We have performed a number of experiments, not just we, fortunately, but by then actually this became a real community. So actually, at the beginning of the new millennium, there have been about a couple of hundred citations for papers published in this area. This number grew by the end of the past decade to 30,000. So this shows a real community emerged. And we thought, well, this community is now established, and these new techniques are now being applied to all sorts of fundamental questions. But could this technology be perhaps useful for something beyond actually the laboratories of scientific research? And we came up with a tentative answer, which we didn't know whether it's going to work, as usual. But we were at least bold enough to ask ourselves whether actually this new technology could possibly do something for healthcare, do something for medicine, do something for improving medical diagnostics. That's when we asked this question, and here I would like to cite, I'd like to quote Professor Rubik. I very much enjoyed his book Cubed, where he actually makes a fantastic statement. He makes many very, I think, wise statements in that book, but this one I particularly captured my attention, namely, in nearly every aspect of life, one of the most important and at the same time also most difficult challenge is to ask the right question. And I was not aware of the importance of asking the right question back in 2015. Now I'm aware of that, thanks to the book of Professor Rubik. I was not aware, but was lucky enough that I think we asked the right question. And the right question was whether actually at that time, whether attosecond technology could be useful for something else than scientific research. And our tentative answer was, let's try to use it for medical diagnostics. And the concept is basically very simple. Just take a really a drop of blood, transilluminate it with a very short infrared pulse, with a very short flash of infrared light. This infrared pulse hits the molecules like the musician hits the tuning fork with his or her hammer. The tuning fork vibrates after the hammer is gone. The musician listens to it and tunes his or her instrument. And we also listen to the molecules after the infrared pulse.
And the molecules tell you the truth.
And the molecule hopefully will tell us everything about the health state of the individual, right? These are not sound waves, though, what the molecules send out, as opposed to the tuning fork, but also infrared waves. And that's where attosecond technology comes into the game, because that's what we need to actually capture the electric field oscillations of these infrared fields that are sent out from the vibrating molecules of the blood sample. And as you can imagine, these are hundreds of thousands of different molecules. Many of them contribute to this. Unfortunately, not all of them yet, because there are also some which are present in very small concentration, those we don't see yet, but there are thousands in relatively high concentrations that do contribute to this signal, which we can measure these days, and therefore this signal contains a lot of information about all those molecules, from which current contemporary laboratory medicine captures only a few dozens, right? When you go to a doctor and you're on a blood draw, then you get your medical report and you see, okay, there are these 25 parameters have been measured, and you get the info which one is in the normal range, that's fine, and maybe some of them are out, and then the doctor concludes, okay, we need to have you basically for another investigation.
That basically would open a new dimension for medical purposes, if my understanding is right.
This is the hope, right?
Very well. It was a very plastic description, actually, what you are dealing with and what you wanted to achieve. I wanted to step back a little bit of theorizing, because you just mentioned two very important elements. Actually, one is putting the right question, and previously going for something big, a bigger understanding of the big truth, which obviously I'm a scientist too, or rather I was a historian, and choosing the good method promises actually finding something that we all wanted to go for, the truth. I'm not talking about the Holy Grail, because that would be a futile attempt, but for something that is beneficial for humanity. And again, in one previous interview, you formulated this in a way that there's no such thing as Hungarian science or US science or German or Austrian science. As a matter of fact, giving an answer why you are going for the opportunity actually where you can go forward with your research in Austria today, nowadays in Germany. It gives a perfect answer for that. In your quest, in your search for these big answers, does your Hungarian mindset help you? If we don't talk about Hungarian science, probably there's something to do with the mindset of people actually in that. And very obviously we're given the question actually that do you see any reason that there are so many Hungarians who were awarded the Nobel Prize, and how interesting that you are one of them, you are the latest of them. Does it have to do anything with the Hungarian mindset and with that cultural genetic inheritance actually we Hungarians have in Central Europe?
This is a very deep question, and I'm not sure whether I will be able to actually satisfactorily answer it, but at least I can attempt to give you some tentative answers, which I don't think will be complete, but maybe just provides at least some contributions to the big answer, which probably would require more time to actually to be given. I used to emphasize in all interviews so far the importance of the educational system. I think one of the reasons is why Hungary, together with not very many countries, by the way, Austria is in the same category as in Hungary, similar sized country with even slightly more Nobel laureates than Hungary. So I think one of the distinguishing features of these countries must be that they must have a really outstanding educational system, and not just at university level, but perhaps even more importantly, actually at the basic level, because that's when actually we human beings start thinking about our own future, right? I mean,
developing the interest in something.
Exactly. What is interesting? That's not so interesting for me. That's when actually first kind of decisions about the future career path are not even consciously, right? But when the first decisions are being made, and I can just present myself as a living example for this, because I truly believe that the first that way more than 50% of the decision that I'm going to become a physicist and researcher was actually done in the primary school, thanks to a terrifically good, also very rigorous, was still allowed, but outstanding teacher who made physics appearing a very easy thing.
Which is very difficult, because we all know that physics seems to be so abstract. Making it understandable first.
My answer to this, physics can be very difficult if the teacher is not good, and physics can be very simple if the teacher is good.
Very well. That's a partial answer to my question. Yes. The big question.
The second part. Well, I think whether it's now a mindset or whether it's kind of dictated by circumstances, but we all know that Hungarians are extremely hardworking people, right? Which is probably also partially the reason why we die earlier than people in the surrounding countries, right? The average life expectancy in Hungary is 5 to 6 years shorter than in Austria, Germany, or in other countries just not so far away from here. Well, I think this is also part of the answer, because no matter how creative you are, no matter how great ideas you have, if you are not hardworking, then these remain ideas and plans, but these will never be put into practice and never will become reality. So I would say at least 50% of any success story must be the willingness to be hardworking, to be persistent, to have a great deal of perseverance, and the ability to kind of to survive setbacks, and to not allow yourself to be discouraged by lack of success, lack of progress, even over extended period of time. which unfortunately happens if you are doing research at the cutting edge.
Rings the bell because Katalin Karikó has thanked actually to many of her adversaries that she received the Nobel Prize the same year you received, meaning obviously what you mean here, that discouraging and telling you that no, you are not going to succeed can be as big an inspiration as your own driving force itself.
This is correct. Yes, absolutely. I have also read a little bit her story, and I have to say that fortunately for me, I perhaps didn't face that many obstacles during my career as she did, and I was fortunate enough to have really prominent and strong supporters who backed me and who drive me forward and gave me a lot of freedom. In Austria, Arnold Schmidt was not just my boss at the institute where I had the chance to work 17 years, but was also at the same time my mentor, kind of my second father, so to speak, and therefore I was certainly lucky from that point of view. But I think it's certainly true that. We have had quite a few situations where we asked ourselves, well, is this worthwhile to pursue this? Isn't this just too risky? And it's not just yourself, because it's always a team. You are responsible for your team members. These are young scientists who would like to get a degree in the next few years, and then would like to pursue their career with that degree, and so on and so forth. And one is also responsible for all these young people around, and therefore just to say, okay, well, I'm patient enough, and even if it takes now 10 years without any publication to get the big breakthrough, I will do it. That's not that simple. Because these team members really need something that is kind of measurable, and that's sometimes a real challenge.
If the football team, the national football team, wins a match, as it happened the day before yesterday, the other day, all young guys wanted to become football players. Do you believe that an award like this, the reward for the perseverance actually you were talking about, can contribute to more young people, primary school, secondary, or in the midterms, come to this field? Because this is a podcast where we always talk about things in a very frank manner. We all face the reality on the ground that, especially the natural sciences, there's a lack of substitutes actually to the system, and that those are coming into the system and will become or would become teachers and help to foster, to go for what you've been telling us, how you got the inspiration and how you started your career, at least in your head, and then later in your personal career. Do you believe it can help? We face this reality, and that is the structural, methodological problems coming into the educational system, not only the primary and secondary education, but also the universities. What's the way out of it? How can you convince young people that in today's world, which is becoming ever faster in terms of how we live our lives, how we communicate, how we would like to have knowledge as fast as possible, that perseverance, and that is taking time, sometimes decades on the same topic, at the end of the day can become a fruitful contribution to your own life and therefore to humanity?
These have been quite a few questions. So I would start perhaps with the first one, where I think this Nobel Prize for someone coming from Hungary, coming actually from a small village at that time and so on, might help to encourage young people, teenagers, to orient themselves in that direction. I think the answer is a clear yes, and I don't just believe it, but I'm really receiving dozens of emails from high school students these days, which are really heartwarming. Yeah, really heartwarming. Actually, I decided to invite one, even, or asked the organizers kindly to invite one of them for the gala dinner this evening, and would like to comment on that in a couple of sentences. I do believe and I do hope that indeed we can utilize this prize for this purpose, and I would indeed really would like to undertake some active measures in this direction. I'm getting a lot of invitations now from every part of the country and also of course in other countries, and here particularly Hungary. I would like to connect whenever I go to an event. I would like to ask the organizers to connect this to the opportunity to call together the local school children, interested school children, and I would very much like to give a kind of generally understandable lecture to kind of inspire them and motivate them and actually tell them the message that they should be bold enough to dream and work on making their dreams come true. And I would not like to kind of try to provide some sort of recipe because there is no recipe for how to eventually achieve the goals. Of course, one can give many advices, but I would perhaps recommend one thing before they actually decide to become a researcher, to become a scientist. They should very deeply think whether they think that this would fulfill them with satisfaction and would cause them a great deal of happiness and joy. Because if this is the case, the rest is going to come. Whatever else they need to be successful, this is going to come. If you find that when you go to the workplace, you don't feel this as work, but you feel joy, and you can't expect after having a vacation to go back and start the so-called work again, which is not felt to be work, then the rest is going to work.
When we are having this conversation, I'm not only talking to a man with full of energies, but apparently to someone who is not going to be satisfied or think that this is the end of a career, actually, that the Nobel Prize has fallen on him. Many say, or many wrongly believe, that the Nobel Prize is the end of a career. We all know that it is not the case. Awarding a prestigious award like that always carries this, but the Nobel Prize specifically actually is about those researches you've been telling us in a very handleable manner, actually, what it is about. What's next?
Next is to actually put this invention to practice, put this to work. And this is what the CMF project is about. So actually you are perfectly right. There is absolutely no reason, or at least that's how I feel it, there is no reason to feel any satisfaction. This is of course a big boost. It's not a satisfaction, but it's a tremendous boost. And I do see already now that this prize is opening doors which could not have been opened that fast or at any time, maybe in the foreseeable future. And I would certainly like to walk in and walk through these doors and see how we can actually expedite our progress because we have really ambitious goals. I think if we can just get closer to these goals that we are pursuing here within the CMF project, this will not only have a big impact on the Hungarian healthcare system, but my ambition actually is that kind of the future preventive medicine, which we have the chance to establish here in Hungary for the first time on a worldwide scale, will certainly spread very quickly all over the world, because the demand is there in any other country just as it is in Hungary.
Very well. Again, congratulating for you to be the latest Hungarian laureate for the Nobel Prize. Myself and the Hungarian government wish you success with your undertakings and those plans. I can see it in your eyes that you think it's going to be successful. Thank you for the discussion today. Keep in mind that we are going to continue with this new season. stay with us and continue listening to The Bold Truth of Hungary.